Bright Tuty. Every student matters.
Hello dear students, welcome to another lecture. In this class, we are going to begin with the first poem of Class 11th Alternative English Nagaland Board, which is The Slave's Dream by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Now, the name of the poem in itself is suggestive of the fact that we are talking about a slave. Now, who is a slave? Slave is somebody who is supposed to follow the instructions given by the master. A slave is somebody who is treated in such, an inhumane manner that he or she automatically loses the will to live and to survive. A slave is somebody who is supposed to leave behind the life that they had earlier and live like no less than an animal. Now, in this poem, we are going to read about the story wherein, a man, now years ago, basically, what would happen is that people from South Africa would be captured and they would be hired as slaves, by the people. Because of the race, because of the culture that they were born in, they were not given any sort of respect. Now, this poem that we shall be reading is one similar poem in which a slave, a person who has been captured, from the west of Africa, is dreaming about the kind of life he had and the kind of life he would want to have, And he begins dreaming and reaches the final abode, that is, he dies within his sleep. So we shall be reading this poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Now first let us know something about the poet. So Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, he was an American poet who basically had given a lot of important works in the field of literature of America. He would travel a lot, he was a linguistic, he was a romantic, as well as he very well knew about the traditions of the European literature and he was aware of their thought processes as well. He was very learned in American history as well as the literature. Now, as I told you, The Slave's Dream is telling us about the nature of slavery and the freedom that a slave wants to have. This poem, written by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, is one of the 8 slavery poems in the collection Poems on Slavery, which were published in December 1942. The poem has been written in a beautiful manner. It is very emotional and it talks about the emotional journey, the emotional image of an African king who became as a slave and who died in the rice fields, thinking and remembering and dreaming about his motherland, his wife, his children. So what was it that, he actually dreamt about and what did he see in his dream? What happened when he died? We are going to read that all in this poem, The Slave's Dream. Let us begin with the poem now. Beside the ungathered rice he lay, his sickle in his hand. His breast was bare, his matted hair was buried in the sand. Again in the mist and shadow of sleep, he saw his native land. So where was this slave that we are talking about? Who is this slave that we are talking about? He was an African king. So the slave was lying. He was lying on the ground next to the ungathered rice. Ungathered, which is not collected. So, he was probably in a rice field where he had to collect the rice. But rather than doing that, he was lying on the ground with sickle in his hand. Sickle is a kind, it is like this kind of a tool which is used to cut the grass or the crops. So he had his sickle in his hand. He was working in the rice field and he just lay down behind the rice which was not yet collected by him. His breast was bare. Breast refers to his chest. The upper body or the upper part of his body was bare. Bare, it was uncovered. He did not wear anything to cover his chest. His upper body was totally bare. And his matted hair. Now, matted is again something which is uncombed. So his hair was uncombed. He did not wear anything to cover the upper part of his body. And he was buried in the sand. Buried in the sand means he just lay down in the sand of that rice field. And again, now if you see the reference of the word again is that this dream about his native land, native, the place where he belonged to. So dreaming about the land he belonged to was not the first time that he saw it. This was a repeated dream. So again, in the mist and shadow of sleep. Now, what is mist and shadow of sleep? When one is sleeping, one reaches a semi-conscious state of mind. Right? So one reaches a semi-conscious state of mind when one is sleeping. Fine, you keep on thinking about a lot of things, but what you think of is not something which is in reality. Besides, it is very vague and unclear, and the moment you wake up, you tend to forget everything that you had seen. So, what do we know from the first stanza? We know that he was a slave. He was lying on the rice field where he was collecting rice. He had a sickle in his hand, but rather than working on the rice, he just laid down. His body was half submerged, in the sand. His upper body was bare, it was not covered. His hair was uncombed and he was dreaming. And once again, in that semi-conscious state of mind, he dreamt about the place that he belonged to, the place that was his, the place where he was a king. Wide through the landscape of his dreams, the lordly Niger flowed. Beneath the palm trees on the plain, once more a king he strode, and heard the tinkling caravans descend the mountain road. So, wide through the landscape of his dreams. So he was dreaming, and in his dream he came across a wide landscape, a very big, a very open area, a beautiful green area where the lordly Niger river flowed. Niger is a river in the Western Africa. Lordly word means basically majestic, something which is majestic, something which is amazing. Niger is the most important river of the African region. So in his dream, he came across a big piece of land which was green, which was wide. And in that land, he saw the majestic Niger river which was flowing. Beneath the palm trees on the plain, and on the plain area of that land, under the palm trees, once more a king he strode. Strode is the past tense of walk. So basically, So strode is the past tense of stride, which is walking, so walked. So beneath the palm trees, he was walking and he could hear the tinkling of the caravans. Caravans refer, we all know who are caravans. Caravans are a group of people who move from place to place. Okay, so he imagined in his dream a place which was totally in contrast to the place he was living. It was a beautiful place, a beautiful landscape, wide area near the Niger River. And under the palm trees, the king that he was before becoming a slave, he was walking and he could hear the tinkling. Tinkling is the sound. So the sound of the caravans, the people, who do not have a permanent home and they keep on moving from one place to the other. Descend the mountain road, descend, come down. So he could hear the sound of the caravans who were coming down the mountain. So this stanza again represents the beautiful place that he belonged to and that he was a king. He saw once more his dark-eyed queen among her children stand. They clasped his neck, they kissed his cheeks, they held him by the hand. A tear burst from the sleeper's lids and fell into the sand. Now this stanza talks about the slave's family. So once again, now the word once more, is again talking about the fact that this was not the first time when he had dreamt of something like this. So one more time in his sleep, he saw his dark-eyed queen. He saw his queen who had dark eyes, who was standing with her children or their children to be precise. The children of the slave who was a king, they clasped his neck. This has shown the kind of love and affection that the children poured onto their father. They clasped. Clasped means we've all seen the little kids hanging on to the neck and the shoulders of their fathers, right? So the kids of the slave, they had held his neck very tightly. Clasped is to hold something very tightly. So they had clasped his neck and they kissed his cheeks and they held him by the hand. So they were holding the hand of their father. And when the slave dreamt of it, even in his dream, a tear burst from the sleeper's lids. Lids, eyelids, when your eyes are closed. So even when he was sleeping, even though what he was seeing was just a dream, he got so emotional by the memory of his loving family that a tear dropped down his eyes and it fell into the sand. So this shows the plight of the slave, the difficulty that he was dealing with and how much he loved his family. And then at a furious speed he rode along the Niger's bank. His bridle reins were golden chains and with a martial clank. At each leap he could feel his scabbard of steel smiting his stallion's flank. So, and then at furious speed he rode. Again in his dream he saw himself riding at a furious speed. Furious, uncontrollable. So he saw himself riding the horse at a speed which was uncontrollable. And this speed, this shows his desire to be free. So this speed symbolizes his freedom or his desire for freedom. Okay? So he was riding his horse at an uncontrollable speed along the Niger's bank. So on the banks of the Niger River, he was riding his horse. His bridle reins were golden chains. What is a bridle rein? Bridle rein refers to that rope with the help of which you have tied the neck of the horse, or basically when you are riding a horse, the rope that you are holding, in order to control the horse, that is a bridle basically. So those leather straps with which he was controlling his horse, even they were golden chains. Now, they were golden chains. This shows that he indeed was a king and that he was very rich. So, the straps of his horse were also gold. They were of the gold metal and with a martial clank. Martial clank refers to clank means the sound, and martial word is used for the soldiers, the people who fight in the war. So basically, the way his horse was riding and the speed with which he was riding and the golden straps that he had to control his horse simply indicated that he was of a martial race. He was a soldier. He was so perfect with riding the horse and controlling it. At each leap, leap means jump. So whenever the horse would take a leap, whenever the horse would take a jump, he could feel his scabbard of steel smiting his stallion's flank. Scabbard refers to, a blade in which the sword is kept. So he was a king, he was a soldier. We've just read that he belonged to the martial class. So he was wearing a sword, and the cover in which the sword is kept, that is a scabbard. So that scabbard was made of steel, and every time the horse would take a leap, that scabbard which was made of steel would hit. Smitting means when it would hit and a sound would occur. When a metal gets collided with some other piece of metal, there is a sound that we can hear. So the steel smitted his stallion's flank. Flank is obviously, if you've seen a horse, when you sit on a horse for riding, the horse, on the top of the horse is, a piece of leather or a piece of cover which is put so that you can sit on it comfortably, and it covers the sides of the horse as well. So the king in the dream, the slave that he was, so he was wearing a sword, and whenever the horse would take a leap, the scabbard of the slave, which was made of steel, would just collide and get connected, and it was hitting the flake of that stallion, that horse, and the sound was being produced. So this again shows how much he longed to be free again. Okay. Before him, like a blood-red flag, the bright flamingos flew. From morn till night he followed their flight over plains where the tamarind grew, till he saw the roofs of caffre huts and the ocean rose to view. Again, this is showing the beauty of the place that he belonged to. So the beauty of that place is being described. So before him, he could see bright flamingos. Flamingos are kind of birds which are red in color. And these flamingos, because of their red color, have been compared to a bright red flag, a blood red flag. So the flamingos are compared to the flag, and the poetic device that we have used here is simile. Why? Because like is here. We all know that whenever a comparison is made with like or as, that poetic device is known as simile. So before him there was a group of flamingos that were red in color. In fact, as red as the blood red flag would seem to be. From morn means morning. So from the morning till night, he would follow their flight. Flight is when the birds fly, when they take off for the sky, that is the flight. So the birds would keep on flying in the sky, and the king loved to follow them on his horse. He would ride behind them over the plains. So that part of the plain where the tamarind grew. Tamarind is, again, we all know, a type of tree, a tamarind tree. It is even used with cooking. So over the plains, the tamarind was growing. So he would ride over that plain area as well and continue to ride till the time he would see caffre huts. Caffre is basically, the huts of a race which lived in the Central Asia, okay, a tribal race, and their huts were known as caffre. So the caffre huts, he would ride so far that he would see the roofs of the caffre huts and also the ocean. The ocean would also rise so that the king would be able to see the beauty of the ocean. Now again, this stanza tells us about how much he wanted to be free, because ocean is again something which is very huge and it is free. There is no boundary that we have around an ocean. So in this stanza, he talked about how much he enjoyed riding his horse behind the flamingos over the plains and to see the ocean rising in front of him. At night, he heard the lion roar and the hyena scream, and the river hoarse as he crushed the reeds beside some hidden stream, and it passed like a glorious roll of drums through the triumph of history. Now in this stanza, he again talks about freedom, but with the help of some sounds. We all know that those animals who are in a forest which is the habitat of the animals are free there. They enjoy themselves, they enjoy their freedom, and therefore out of freedom, they talk, they roar, they scream, they howl. All these sounds can be heard in the forest. So we talk about the sounds of animals like the lion as well as the hyena. The lion would roar at night, the hyena would scream at night. So this basically shows that even the animals were free in the forest that they lived. And the river horse as he crushed the reeds. Reeds means the tall grasses. So reeds means the tall grasses. So there were tall grasses, and sitting on his horse, he would crush them. He would ride with his horse on these grasses, which were very tall, behind some hidden stream. Stream is a small, river, basically. So he would find himself riding on his horse from morning till night. At night, when the horses would start to roar, the hyenas would start to scream, he would still continue to ride, trampling tall grasses that he would come across, and he would ride behind some of the streams that were hidden. So this shows that the place that he was at was so beautiful that other than the Niger River, there were small streams that one could see or one could, invent and discover from anywhere. And it passed like a glorious roll of drums through the triumph of his dream. Glorious roll of drums we have all seen in the movies, in the cartoons also. Whenever there is a king who would return back from a war, the drums are played at a very high volume, indicating the triumphant return. Triumph means victory. So the sound of those drums signified the victory that the king has achieved. So when he would ride the horse, even in his dream, he would hear the sound of the drums, indicating that he was finally successful. So in his dream, he was wishing to finally get himself free from this place, to go back to his native land, and to find himself a king again. The forest with their myriad tongues shouted of liberty, and the blast of the desert cried aloud with a voice so wild and free that he started in his sleep and smiled at his tempestuous sleep. So, the forest, as we were talking about the forest in the previous stanza, and again here I forgot to tell you, since the word like is used, so the poetic device is simile. Okay, so the forest with their myriad tongues. Myriad means a large number of tongues. Can a forest have a tongue? Is a forest a human being? No, it isn't. Still, if we've used the word tongue for a forest, what is the poetic device here? The poetic device that we are talking about over here is personification. So we are giving human-like attributes to the forest and saying that a forest which is so different types of animals living inside it. Various tongues means with the different kinds of animals who were the inhabitants of the forest. Each one of them was shouting and crying and howling, which signified the liberty with which they were living. So the slave dreaming of it in itself indicated how much he also wanted to be free, just like those animals in the forest. And the blast of the desert cried aloud with a voice so wild and free. So the blast of the desert means the strong winds of the desert. So blast of the desert means the strong winds of the desert. So he could hear the sound of the strong winds that blew in the desert, and the sound of those desert winds again was wild and free. So with everything that he saw in his dream, he associated freedom with it. Be it the sound of the animals, be it the sound of the desert wind that was flowing. And then he started in his sleep. Although he was sleeping, while he slept, he started in his sleep. Started in his sleep means he suddenly shook in his sleep. Shook is the past tense of shake. So this dream in itself made him feel so good that he shook in the dream, in the sleep, and he smiled at his tempestuous glee. Tempestuous is very strong. Glee means happiness. So he was so happy in his dream that his happiness made him smile even when he was asleep. He did not feel the driver's whip nor the burning heat of day, for death had illumined the land of sleep and his lifeless body lay, a worn-out fetter that the soul had broken and thrown away. So finally what happened was, now that he was sleeping, he suddenly stopped feeling the driver's whip. Driver's whip means basically a cord. You must have seen there is something which in the layman's language is known as a hunter. It is a stick which a cord attached to it, and a person who is the master with the help of that whip hits somebody who is his or her slave. So the driver's sleep, driver over here refers to his master. So now suddenly when he was sleeping, he stopped feeling the whip of his master. He could not feel the heat of the day, which was so high that he was actually burning. And why did he stop feeling all those things? Because death had illumined the land of sleep. Illumined means brightened. Now that he was asleep, in his sleep only, death had come to him, and his death had brightened his life in the land of sleep. So while he was in the land of sleep, death came to him and took his soul away. And now his body was lying lifeless on that ground, a worn out fetter. Worn out fetter. Fetter basically refers to the chains that were tied around his feet. Worn out means something which is of no use now, something which is useless. The chains with which the slave's feet were tied, these chains were now of no use because his soul had freed itself. The soul had broken those fetters, thrown it away, and he was free finally from the life of the slave that he was dealing with, and was finally into a free state and was there. Here, worn out fetter is basically a metaphor. Metaphor again is a poetic device wherein a comparison is made but without the usage of like or as. So here, the worn out fetter refers to or compares the slave to a free person now who was no longer in chains, who was no longer in any shackles. Moreover, his body has now left the body was now lifeless. There was no use. His soul was free and he was on his own and could not feel the plight of anything on himself. So with this, my dear students, we come to the end of this poem. As I had told you at the beginning, the poem is a highly emotional tale of how a king, an African king, was forced to be a slave. In the first stanza, we talked about the slave lying with a sickle in his hand in the rice field, where the rice was lying or was, there next to him in an ungathered state. He did not wear anything on his upper part of the body. His hair was not combed and he was sleeping and he was in the subconscious frame of mind. And since he was dreaming, he saw his native land once again. The second stanza, we talked about how in his dream he saw a beautiful landscape alongside the Niger River, which is a river that flows in the Western Africa. He saw himself walking under the palm trees and he could also hear the sound of the caravans that were coming down the mountain. The third stanza talked about his family, his queen, his loving children, and how much he missed them. And thinking about his family in itself in the dream made him cry, and a tear fell down on the sand. Next stanza, we talked about the fact that he indeed was a very wealthy king because his bridle, the leather strap with which he controlled his horse, they were made of gold. He was riding his horse at a very high speed, an uncontrollable speed, which indicated the freedom that he longed for. And he was a soldier. He had a sword in a scabbard, and every time his horse would take a leap, his scabbard would clank with the flank or the cover of the horse. Next, we saw how he, in his dream, saw the red flamingos flying and he chasing the flamingos on his horse, and he would continue to ride on his horse from morning till night, would see the flamingos, would ride over the plains or, near the tamarind trees, would see the hut, the roof of the cafe huts, and also the ocean. Then we talked about the forest and how the animals in the forest were also free. So he could hear the roaring sound of the horse, the screaming of the hyena. He saw himself riding and climbing over the horse, over the tall trees. And when he walked, he even heard the sound of the drums that signified the victory, the triumph of a king. Then the forest, which had different animals in them, they also talked about freedom. He heard the sound of the strong winds that blowed in the deserts. Those sounds were also free and indicated freedom. And thinking about all these beautiful things made him smile in his dream. Finally, at the end, while he was sleeping, he stopped feeling anything, any plight, any torture stopped coming to him, because in his dream only he was transported to the life of death. And finally, the fetters, the chains that bound him, that gave him the the aura, the position of a slave, were now no more of any use, and he was a free soul. So with this, my dear students, we came to the end of this poem. Let us discuss the back exercises now. So, how is the slave introduced to the reader in the first stanza? So in the first stanza, how was the slave introduced? Somebody who was lying in the rice field with a sickle in his hand, matted hair, nothing to cover the upper body, the upper part of his chest. In the second stanza, he is riding along at a normal pace. What does this indicate? So in the second stanza, he was striding along. He was walking at a normal pace. This indicated the fact that he was enjoying the green, the beautiful, and the free environment that he was exposed to, and thus he was relishing the same. Why does the slave move at furious speed in the fourth stanza? And why does he feel the sense of urgency? So why was it so important for him to run in the fourth stanza at such a high speed? This speed in the fourth stanza signifies the need, the desire, the longing of the slave to get freedom. He was running away from the slavery that he was exposed to and wanted to reach his native country back so that he could be free again. What does he hear at night? So at night he heard the roaring of the lions as well as the screaming of the hyena. Why is the lifeless body referred to as a fetter? So his lifeless body was referred to as a fetter because now it was of no use. So just the way the fetters or the chains that were used to tie his feet were of no use. Similarly, his body was of no use to the master now because the soul had left the body. Okay, now let us solve this reference to context. He saw once more his dark-eyed queen among her children stand. They clasped his neck, they kissed his cheeks, they held him by the hand. So what relation does the slave share with the dark-eyed queen? The dark-eyed queen was his wife. Who had surrounded the queen? The queen was surrounded by their children. And why do the queen's children clasp his neck and kiss him? Because these children were the slave's kids and they loved their father and clasping the neck and kissing him indicated the loving family that they were, the beautiful family that he had prior to becoming a slave. Before him, like a blood-red flag, the bright flamingos flew. From morn till night, he followed their flight over the plains where the tamarind grew, till he saw the roofs of caffre huts. So, why are the flamingos referred to as blood-red flag? So, the flamingos were referred to as blood-red flag because, again, a flag signifies freedom. So here, since the slave was longing so much for the freedom, so everything that he saw in his dream was a symbol of freedom that he wanted. Over which areas did the flamingo fly? The flamingo flew over the just a second. Yes, so the flamingo flew over the plains where the tamarind grew. What do the roofs of the caffre huts indicate? The roofs of the caffre huts indicate the height at which his horse would take a leap so that he would be able to see the huts, the roofs of those huts. The forest with their myriad tongues shouted of liberty, and the blast of the desert cried aloud with a voice so wild and free that he started in his sleep and smiled at his tempestuous glee. So how did the forest shout out liberty? So the forest shouted liberty because all the animals in the forest were howling and roaring and screaming because they were free, because they were enjoying the beauty and the greenery that they were surrounded with. So this is exactly what the slave also wanted for himself. Did the desert actually cry out, or was it representing the slave's sense of freedom? Obviously, the desert crying aloud, the free wind that blew in the desert also was an indicator of the freedom that the slave wanted. Why did he smile in his sleep? So he smiled in his sleep because what he saw was such a beautiful dream that just the fact that he was thinking about it gave him happiness. Do you get the impression that the slave's earlier life was glorious? Why? Yes, certainly the earlier life of slave was glorious. He was a king. He was wealthy. He had a kingdom. He had a queen. He had children. He was rich. How do we know that? Because the horse that he would ride, its straps were made of gold. He was free because he continued to ride the whole day. He lived in a place which was beautiful and green because the Niger River flowed and the landscape word has been derived. Is this poem on anti-slavery give reasons? Yes, certainly the poem wishes and expresses its views on how much and how badly and desperately these people who were forced to be the slaves longed for freedom. The life that they had prior to being a slave and the tortures that they had to bear after being one has been talked about. It talks about the pains, the worries that they have, how much they miss the family and their freedom. Freedom is the core theme of the poem. Do you agree? Yes, we totally agree that freedom is the core theme of the poem because the title in itself first is the slave's dream and the opposite of the slave is freedom. So we over here talk about a slave who was longing for freedom. Since the beginning of the poem, from the first stanza, we saw how much this slave wanted to be free, and even in his dream, he was thinking about the native land that he belonged to, the beautiful place that he lived, the animals, the howling sound, the screaming wind, everything indicated towards freedom. And at the end also, he finally got freedom from his slavery, where his body became free and his soul was a free soul. Let us talk about the poetic devices that we have used as we have talked about it. The first poetic device was personification. So the personification is that poetic device in which a non-human thing or a non-living thing is given human attributes. So the lordly Niger is a river. Lordly means something which is majestic. So the qualities of magic are being imbibed in that. Forest with its tongue is personification. The forest shouting for liberty. Forest again is non-living, it cannot shout, but it shouted for liberty. The blast of the desert cried aloud. So the desert crying, desert again is a non-living thing. Still it cried, which indicated its personification, and the desert also had a voice. So these were all the personification, the poetic device that was used. The next poetic device that was used was metaphor. Metaphor is that poetic device in which you are making a comparison between two things without the usage of like and as. So the metaphor that has been used in the poem is fetter. The body of the slave was compared to a fetter because just the way the fetter, the chains that bound his feet were of no use now. Similarly, his body in itself had become useless because it was now without a soul. So with this, my dear students, we come to the end of this poem. I hope the poem was clear to you. We discussed about all the stanzas at length, the word meanings, the back exercises, as well as the poetic devices. So I am going to pause here now and we'll see you all in the next lecture.